Okay, so today we're going to be going over the Echo Saga, Book 1, Rise of the Ranger. Now, this is written by Philip C. Quaintrell, and my first thoughts when I was considering this book series is I didn't want to read something that was going to be a clone copy of Lord of the Rings, or a copy of Dungeons and Dragons. I was pleased to find it wasn't quite that. It had more meat and more personality than what you generally would expect with a clone fantasy novel. Now, Philip C. Quaintrell, in my opinion, does a great job of making you want to read the next page. He actually provides you with intrigue and interest, something that you want to read. You like, ooh, that sounds interesting. What happens next? How did that happen? Where is the story building? So for those purposes, I did get into the deeper meat of the books. Now, the story begins with our main character, Asher, who at this point is, I would say, 10 to 12 years old. Based on the interactions, he couldn't be more than 13, maybe 14 years of age at this point. But he's what's known as an outlander. He is more or less a savage human being, because in this realm, elves are established with cities and civility, whereas humans are still crawling out of the forest. They live in what's known as the Evermore. It's roughly 500 miles north to south, and the people in the Evermore live like hunter-gatherers, more or less savages. But in this specific case, Asher and his family have been sort of taken in by the elves to teach them civility, and in Asher's specific case, to be taught magic. Now, the elf that is in charge of teaching Asher magic, her name is Nalana. Now, you're led to believe that Nalana is some form of royalty, but they don't quite say. They don't give her a title. It's not princess, it's not queen, it's nothing like that. You can just tell that amongst the elves in Eleuthera, the place they reside, she is a very important elf. Now, the story starts off with Asher being frightened. He's alone in a room, and there is a cacophony happening outside. There is something catastrophic going on, and he only knows the elven word for it. And that word is war. In his language, he knows battles. His tribes have battles. His clans have battles, but he has never seen a war. He looks over the balcony. He looks out the window. He looks and he sees almost endless amounts of units. Archers, siege engines, soldiers. He has never seen firsthand a war. Now, as Asher is watching all of this unfold, two elves burst into his room mid-combat. One is a female elf dressed in long flowing robes, and the other seems to be a male elf completely covered head to toe in black so as not to make out his features. The female elf is indeed Nalana, the one that has been teaching Asher magic. As she battles the elf in black, two more elves in black battle. It might be four more. I'm not 100% sure, but also, at that same time, her brother, Elam, enters the fray as well. Now, Elam charges in with his double-headed spear, thinking he's gonna win the day, he's gonna be the day, but that's not quite how it pans out. In reality, what happens is he jumps in, starts fighting more than he can handle, and his sister has to fend off her initial combatant while progressively fighting the others to make her way to her brother so that she can in the end kill all of them and save her brother. So, sorry Elam, I know you wanted to be the hero, but today is not your day, and you are going to get swept under the rug quite promptly. Now, after all that combat is done, Nalana proceeds to find Asher. She proceeds to hand him Paldora's gem. Now, if I were to describe Paldora's gem, I would say it's not quite shaped spherical. It's more shaped like a streaming comet with a tail, but the base of it at its widest point is about the size of a large thumb, if that makes any sense. That's kind of how they describe it. So it's a comet-shaped gem, and it's supposed to be black as night, and this gem is what Valinus, the dark elf, is on his way here for. So, in essence, what is happening here is that the elves are in a sort of civil war. The elves of Eleuthera are trying their hardest to keep Paldora's gem from the dark elf Valinus, who is also known as the Dark Lord, and probably 4 or 5 other monikers that every Dark Lord seems to have. But that's his goal. He wants Paldora's gem that is now being entrusted to Asher. So the elves of Ilithyra at this point are so desperate that they are down to their last leg and they are begging the dragons for help, which apparently the dragons reluctantly agreed because even they think, this Valinus guy is getting a bit out of hand. We should probably swat him down before it gets too bad. So they're all there. The dragons, the Dragon King himself, along with all the elven leaders and the elven casters, are all in one large chamber, and they are going to attempt to altogether cast what they call the Amber Spell. Now, what the Amber Spell is designed to do is it's designed to freeze the city of Ilithyra in time forever, so that anybody within the city or around the nearby city will be frozen perpetually in time for eternity, and that's how they plan to trap Valinus and win the war. Now, I just want to take this moment to point out that there is an actual structure to the way magic works in the Echoes saga. There is a give and a take. How magic works is the more you cast, the more drained you are. You're going to feel physically drained to the point where if you cast too much, you're going to hit the dirt and you're going to pass out. Quite literally, you will drain yourself. But a lot of times what mages and casters will do is they will sort of stockpile their magic energy into small crystals, which act as reservoirs for when they don't want to draw upon their own stores or they don't have any of their own stores left to draw upon. So now that you factor that into consideration, casting a spell like the Amber Spell, which is meant to freeze an entire city for all of eternity, I feel like there's not literally enough magical energy in the entire realm to achieve that. Don't get me wrong, they got a good armada of dragons, elves, and every possible thing they could gather to pull this off. But an eternity kinda sounds like yeah, it definitely works for now, but we'll deal with it later kind of problem solving, if you get what I'm saying. So then, getting back to Asher, while all of this is going on, he was told to take the gem and run, and his father and older brother definitely have no problem with those orders because they're still more savage than even Asher is. So they see something like this happening and they are already hitting the door. The problem is, Asher's father is a little bit quicker than his sons, and you can tell the confliction on his face if he wants to risk himself dying to save his sons or if he just wants to hightail it out there and save himself. So his father's up front, his older brother's in front of him, and he is straggling behind. He's just not as quick as the rest, and then that is when the scene ends. The next thing that happens is Asher wakes up. He wakes up outside of the Wild Moors. He looks around. He has no idea what has happened. A minute ago, he was running from the Amber Spell and all hell was breaking loose, and now he's just sitting on the edge of the moors in the middle of the morning, and it's quiet. He looks up and he sees one man, and this man is confused to see Asher. He walks up to Asher and he asks him what he's doing out here. Nobody ever comes close to the ruins of Ilithyra, which of course leaves Asher confused. Ruins? He was just at Ilithyra moments ago, and at that moment, Asher turns around and sees the ruins of Ilithyra. The man sees the confusion on Asher's face and asks him if he knows that place, whereas Asher doesn't quite know how to respond. The man thinks Asher is simply a confused outlander that doesn't know where he's at. And he announces to Asher that his name is Naster Nal Akit, and he is a member of Nightfall. So then at this point, Naster Nal Akit tells Asher that Ilithyra fell over 1,000 years ago during the Dark War, before the elves left the continent. So Asher comes to the conclusion in his head that apparently he's been trapped in the Amber Spell for the last 1,000 years. Now, he doesn't tell Naster this, he just kind of keeps it to himself because he's not quite sure. That's just his own personal guess. And from this point forward, the story actually skips ahead 40 years. to the point where Asher is an older man in his mid-50s and he's traveling the road as a ranger. You learn that he did spend a large portion of his life in Naster Nal-Aket's organization known as Nightfall, where he became an Arakesh, which is the elven word for assassin. So then we get back to Asher, as he has accepted a job from a town known as Whistletown to seek out and destroy some sort of beast or creature. They don't know if it's a werewolf, but they know it's something big and it's killing the locals. So he is out in the Evermoors once again, and he is trying to hunt this thing down. Now, he knows he's close to it because he's a good tracker. He can see the signs, the foliage, the lack of animals, and he makes his way deeper and deeper into the forest until all the light slowly disappears. And not because of the daytime or anything going on naturally, it's because there's a magic aura that is blocking out the physical light, which is a dead giveaway if I've ever seen one. So clearly, he just marches right in. He is quite experienced at this point, and he is fully confident that he himself is the most dangerous thing in this forest. Now, as he approaches the beast's lair, he pulls out a red bandana and ties it over his eyes so that he cannot see at all. This, in turn, activates his Night's Eye elixir that they literally breed into you at nightfall. They essentially administer doses of this elixir to you over and over and over until it sinks into your bones, it sinks into your blood, it sinks into your system itself, so that any time you are put in the dark without your vision, this Night's Eye elixir immediately becomes active. Now, let's talk about the Night's Eye elixir. It, in my personal opinion, is kind of that tropey thing, that whole daredevil, blind samurai kind of thing, to where you don't use your eyesight, but your other senses are so absolutely heightened that it makes you even more aware of it. It's kind of that whole thing. It's essentially an elixir that does that. You can't use your sight, but your hearing, your sensory, your awareness, everything else is heightened to an extent to where it actually elevates you above your original level that you would have with your sight. Now, on the point of the Night's Eye elixir, I don't have a problem with things like that in a story, but as a writing perspective, if you're going to introduce something like the Night's Eye elixir, you have to be sure to keep it relevant so it doesn't just become this background thing that people every now and then are like, oh yeah, they do that, huh? Now, on top of his elixir and his skills as an Arakesh, he can also conjure nearly any form of magic at any time with no penalty, no incantation, no wand, no staff, no requirements, because Paldora's gem that he woke with still in his hand apparently after 1,000 years, he eventually fashioned a piece of that gem into a ring, and now this ring allows him nearly infinite magic opportunities. So he steps into the beast's lair. Instantly, he lights a globe of light. He sends it into the air, and he can tell right away that something in the upper layer is preventing that light from shining. There's something so dark in the upper layer that it is literally overwhelming the light of his spell. And he gets the feeling that whatever is here is a corrupted essence. Something here has been poisoning this part of the wood for a long period of time. A decrepit old voice tells Asher that he should have never came here and that he's simply going to end up a meal for his beasts like all the others. And clearly Asher pays no mind to this because he's quite used to everything that he's been paid to kill insulting him and telling him what a terrible mistake he's made. Asher proceeds to simply document his surroundings. He can tell out the corners of his eyes that there is a few giant spiders along with a massive wolf, all slowly making their way in on him. While searching for the source of the voice, he chooses not his broadsword, instead his short sword. He carries 2 blades, and the short sword that he chooses on this occasion is actually made of a mineral called Sylvir. Sounds like silver, but apparently this mineral is just amazing in every way possible, and there is nearly 2 or 3 swords made of this stuff south of the dwarven border, which is a whole nother thing in itself. So let's just say for now, this sword is a pretty big deal. It apparently has runes in it that are older than the elves themselves. Asher then proceeds to pull his short sword right when the spiders launch their attack. He kills 2 or 3 of them in swift measure and then proceeds to move on to the massive wolf. The wolf has him, it seems, cornered up until Asher uses his ring to produce a concussive kind of magic that pushes the wolf back and gives Asher the advantage. It's at this point that the decrepit looking man descends from the lair and confronts Asher himself. The man, after inquiring about his staff, proceeds to tell Asher that he found it off of a merchant's cart, that the merchant had no idea what it really was he carried, and that since then he has become so much more powerful and everything has gotten so much better, while Asher proceeds to tell the man that it has probably stolen most of his life force already, and that he'd do best to discard it and save whatever few years left he has of his life. Clearly, this does not happen. In the end, this fight really is not much of a challenge for Asher and his current abilities. He manages to overpower the man and the wolf with relative ease, using everything at his disposal. As he swings his sword, he decapitates both the man and the head of his staff in one quick motion. He looks down upon the man's withered head and thinks to himself that he could never claim his prize if he brought in that man's head, for everybody would think he simply killed a beggar and brought that in. No, he would have to take the wolf's head and exclaim that that was the true beast if he wished to collect any prize. Alright, now we move over to our next set of characters. We have the pair of greycoats known as Nathaniel and Elaith. Nathaniel is the more seasoned greycoat. He's been doing this for a while. I'd put him mid-30s. I'd say about 33 to 36 years old, while Elaith is more like a ward. She is still learning, in fact going outside of the walls of Westphalia where the greycoats are trained. This is actually like her graduation mission, so to speak. If she can go out and apprentice under Nathaniel until he deems her worthy, she can then graduate as a full-fledged greycoat. And essentially what a greycoat is it's a sort of a policing force between the kingdoms. There is, I believe, 6 kingdoms, and they don't quite play the Game of Thrones to where they're always at war, but they also don't get along either. So Elaith, she has a conversation with Nathaniel to where she kind of tries to prod some information out of him. She knows that Nathaniel is kind of like the black sheep of the greycoats because the greycoats aren't supposed to have families. And Nathaniel is the only second generation greycoat that there ever was because his father broke those rules and had Nathaniel himself. So he's kind of like a black mark on the greycoats. It's also noted that he's probably like their best archer, and that the Lord Marshal of the greycoats isn't quite fond of this simply because apparently he's been trying to find ways to get rid of Nathaniel. He's not quite so underhanded that he's gonna have him killed, but he's definitely been sending Nathaniel on all the missions that are not favorable, trying to get him to either quit his position or be put in a predicament that he can't do nothing but fail. And Elaith is trying to kind of prod out some of that information, and Nathaniel's simply not biting. He won't give in to the questions she's prodding, and he just stays on the task. They're going to meet up with a man named Master Bale, a greycoat informant. He apparently was a full-fledged greycoat at some time, but on one of his very first missions, he took a pretty nasty set of injuries to the face and body to the point where it left him pretty much crippled. So now he's relegated to simply being an information man, somebody who has a network of children spies. So Nathaniel and Bale don't quite like each other. They're casually insulting each other back and forth for a little while before Bale decides to pull out a scroll that has Nathaniel's orders on it. Now, the scroll, which is signed by the Lord Marshal of the Greycoats himself, notes that Nathaniel and Elaith are to capture the ranger known as Asher, and this strikes Nathaniel immediately. He wants to know, is this the Asher that he knows, that he's thinking of? Because the Asher that he knows is definitely not an easy person to catch, and he does not think that they are up for the task, even if they had backup, which they don't. And Master Bale essentially makes the remark that he thinks that either he'll catch him or he'll die trying, and either way works just fine for the Greycoats. They don't need Nathaniel if he's not going to be of any use to them. And so Elaith, she has no idea who Asher is. So she looks at Nathaniel completely puzzled, and she wants to know, why is he so concerned? And he ignores her. He's all sorts of in his head, and he essentially takes the information, and he wants to know where Asher is now. And Bale informs him that he should be at the tavern. He just returned with the head of a wolf, and he should be drinking his prize away. Nathaniel questions the solidity of Bale's sources, but Bale laughs him off and tells him that he's definitely there. If his informant says he's there, then he is there. So we cut to the scene. Nathaniel and Elaith are standing in the rain, and they're just now walked in the tavern. And right away, Nathaniel looks at the bar, and he can see Asher slumped over, appearing to be drunk, ordering another flagon of ale. So it's at this point that Nathaniel tells Elaith why he's so scared of Asher. He notes that the first time he ever seen Asher, Asher had dealt with 3 to 4 Greycoats without even a scratch on him. He had killed 3 to 4 Greycoats without being touched, and he was blindfolded the whole time. He knew that he had been in Arakesh, and that about 12 years ago he had actually forsaken the Arakesh, the only person known to have done that. And he did that in spectacular fashion. Apparently 12 years ago, the Arakesh were hired to kill Queen Isabella, and Asher prevented that from happening. He killed 2 of his own Arakesh kind and then fled the scene. That is the only recorded time that they have ever recovered bodies of Arakesh in history, and that apparently is the day that Asher turned. Nathaniel thinks they have no chance of capturing Asher, but he's going to approach it the only way he knows how. He's going to sneak up behind him and try and get the jump on him while he's drinking. He tells Elaith not to make too sudden moves because he doesn't know what will happen. And as they approach Asher from behind, they prepare to ambush him, and right as they're about to make their move, he slumps over off of his stool and slams into the ground, drunk, passed out. Now, as they collect Asher's belongings, Nathaniel makes a particular notice of Asher's silver sword. He tells Elaith that this sword must have originated from Danaheim, the land of the dwarves, and it must have been crafted by a dwarf. He tells her that Danaheim is the land of the dwarves, and it is northern of Ilion, so all the 6 kingdoms of Ilion is southern to the land of Danaheim, and Danaheim is extremely arctic and mountainous climate, where no man is allowed to enter. Dwarves do not mix with the other races, and you do not go into their lands, so very little is known of Danaheim. And now it's at this point that the book changes scenes, and it brings us to a group of elves. Now this group is led by an elf named Galanor. Amongst the hierarchy of elven society, Galanor is not royalty, but he holds a position in one of the noble houses. He is not the head of the house, that would be his father, but he is indeed part of a noble house, and he has been sent here by his father and by King Ella. And this is the same Ella that was brother to Nalana when Asher watched the battle of the Dark Elves 1,000 years ago. He is now king of his people, and he has sent Galanor along with a handful of other elves on a covert mission to the island nation of Dragorn. Now, Ilion is where the main story takes place. It is where the 6 human kingdoms reside. It is where Ilathyra was before it was destroyed 1,000 years ago. And Ada is the lands across the sea to the east, where the elves fled after the war. After the war 1,000 years ago, they left Ilion altogether and forged themselves a new land on Ada. So a Dragorn is the island nation in between those 2 lands. And it just so happens that Dragorn is also the nation of mages. Their entire nation is nearly all magical based. They're all mages, sorcerers, wizards, and witches, and their main magic school for all of Ilion is located on this island as well. The school is called Corcanith, and while Dragorn is an island nation, Corcanith sits on a separate island in the archipelago, and it is wholly guarded by one of the last dragons in existence, Maliath the Voiceless. So Galanor and his crew need to get to the island of Corcanith itself, where the mage school lies. But according to him, they cannot simply swim there. The distance is too far, the sea is too rough, and so they need assistance. I'm assuming how they got to Dragorn in the first place was by means of magic use, because the elves are a lot more adept with magic and its uses than humans are. So they probably got this far based off of magic, but to get the rest of the way, they will require assistance. So for that assistance, Galanor proceeds to perform a slight ritual so that he may attempt to summon mermen. He does this ritual in the shallows of the coast, and he waits a little bit, and then eventually 1, 2, 3 mermen appear out of the water. Now, these mermen are described as being more ancient than the elves themselves. These mermen are not too happy to be summoned. In fact, they're not too pleasant of creatures at all to begin with. They were summoned with a ritual that involved children's blood, and they are not all too happy that when they show up, there is no children to be had. They are angry at Galanor for disrespecting them, and they demand to know why a human such as himself even knows how to summon them, let alone dares to summon them. And he is quick to point out that he is no human, that he is simply using an illusion of disguise to present himself as a human, and that he is actually an elf. And if the merman would simply take a closer look with a more magical touch rather than using his eyes, he would see that Galanor is indeed an elf. And after the merman gets uncomfortably close to Galanor, he does indeed realize that Galanor is an elf, and he's not pleased, but he is more willing to listen. He asks why Galanor has summoned them. Galanor is quick to get down to business, and he notes that he needs the 6 of them carried to the shores of Corcanith. The merman states that even if they wanted to carry them to Corcanith, the elves, even with their superior bodies, would never survive the journey, whereas one of Galanor's crew remarks that they will take care of that just fine, hinting at their use of magic. It is at this time that the merman states that he will need payment in exchange for their services. There is 6 elves, which will require 6 mermen, and they each will require a child as payment. And now this takes Galanor aback. He is shocked. He tries not to show it, but on the inside, he's dismayed. He does not want to sacrifice children. He wants to do this as cleanly as possible. He also doesn't think he could even get a hold of 6 children without causing attention to his group. He tries to protest. He asks if there is anything else the merman would desire instead of the children, and the merman simply states that if he cannot get the children, then they do not have a deal. And he is quite firm on that. As the merman begins to fade away, Galanor asks him to wait. Galanor softly reminds him who is asking this. The elven king does not take favors lightly, and he asks if there is anything else that they could possibly use as payment other than children. The merman takes this into consideration, and he says that they will still require 3 children, but then also 2 women of the most beautiful quality that Galanor can find. Also, something to keep in mind when he's dealing with this dilemma is something that I'm not sure if I've mentioned yet or not, but most elves could care less about human life. They have a perception that elves are better than man in every way, and man is just a burden on the land, on the creatures that have to coexist together, on absolutely everything. So Galanor actually having confliction with this kind of decision is actually pretty rare, because most elves would just be like, yeah, sure, that's what we need to do. On it, boss. But no, at this point, he's gonna agree. He's gonna get the children and get the women, but he is definitely not liking the path he's going down. So we're gonna leave it there for today, and then we will pick up again with part 2, and I hope to see everyone there.